We're going to continue on with the gram-negative bacteria and finish up with the proteobacteria, which remember is the largest taxonomic group of bacteria. Another class of the proteobacteria is the gamma proteobacteria, which you do not need to know that name. And then the gamma proteobacteria is further subcategorized into these different orders here, which again, you don't need to know any of these orders or which bacteria belong in the orders or which bacteria are gamma proteobacteria. I'm not going to ask you that. And I'm not going to ask you that, oh, Salmonella, is that gram-negative or gram-positive? I won't ask you that either. So you can look at this. It's interesting. We're not going to talk about all of these, but here are just some examples of gamma proteobacteria. So we'll talk about some of these, but not all of them. Okay, so an example of a gamma proteobacteria is Pseudomonas aeruginosa. This bacteria you will not forget once you have a patient that you've seen with it. It has some very characteristic things that it does. One of them is that it creates a green-blue pus. So this greenish-blue pus coming out of these wounds, that is just disgusting, and no other bacteria does that infects humans, and so that's pretty characteristic of a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection. The other thing is that it smells really bad. So once you smell a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection that a patient has, it has this very, I don't know, kind of sour smell to it. Once you smell it, you won't forget it. And it's a very strong smell, and you can even smell it before you go into the patient's room. And you can just diagnose them even before you go in the room. You're like, oh yeah, they've got a Pseudomonas infection, because you can smell it. It's that disgusting. Okay. All right, we have another word here, a nosocomial infection. What that word means is that this is an infection that a patient will acquire while they're in the hospital. So they didn't come in with it, but they get infected with something while they're in the hospital. So you also see these nosocomial infections called healthcare associated infections, or HAIs. So sometimes you might see that listed on a chart or something in the hospital. So these are unfortunately problem bacteria in the hospitals that will infect patients there. So they can get into wounds, they can also cause urinary tract infections, and they're also a common cause of pneumonia in cystic fibrosis patients. So we do see that as well. And they're also hard to treat, so they are resistant to some of our antibiotics. So if you remember, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is one of our escape pathogens. So remember the P in escape, that's Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And remember, the escape pathogens we're worried about because we've got a lot of antibiotic resistance, they're hard to treat, and we see a lot of these guys infecting our hospitalized patients. So they're a problem. Okay, and then right below where we've got the patient with the green pus, right below that is a picture of the Pseudomonas aeruginosa bacteria, and you can see they've got some flagella there, and so that's what they look like. All right, our next gamma proteobacteria, we've got Acinetobacter baumannii, and this one is a pretty scary bacteria as well. And remember that the Acinetobacter baumannii is also an escape pathogen. So it's the A in escape. So that means we've got lots of antibiotic resistance with this bacterium, and it can also cause these nosocomial infections. So they end up infecting these hospitalized patients. They didn't come in with this, but they get infected while they're in the hospital. So I've got kind of a nice little picture over here to remind you that Acinetobacter baumannii, killer germ in ICU wards. So it's not a good one to get. And there's a picture, or sorry, not a picture, a link here if you're interested. This is an article about a guy who he was traveling and he ended up in a hospital in Egypt, and he ended up with an infection in his abdomen with Acinetobacter baumannii, and he almost died with it. So he ended up making it back to the States, and his Acinetobacter baumannii was resistant to every antibiotic we had. They had nothing to treat him with, and he was dying. So they were looking around like, what can we do to save him? And so they decided, well, let's treat him with a bacteriophage, a virus that infects this particular bacteria and kills it. And so that's what they gave him. So they gave him this virus, this bacteriophage that just infects this bacteria, and it killed his infection, and he survived, and he's alive today because of that. So it's a really interesting story if you want to read about that. So, and they've also done a TED Talk as well if you want to Google their names. So it's a pretty interesting story, and she also wrote a book on him too. This bacteria, you might also hear it called Iraqibacter because it was a problem in the Iraq War. A lot of the American soldiers, some of them got infected. Their wounds got infected with that when they were in the army hospitals there, because this bacteria can live in the soil, and it had gotten into some of the wounds in the soldiers, and it was resistant to all the antibiotics, and so they had to do some amputations because they couldn't treat it. So sometimes you might hear it called Iraqibacter. So, okay, our next gram-negative gamma proteobacteria is called Legionella, and this one is rather interesting. It likes to live in water tanks, water pipes, air conditioning units, because there's water that collects in there as well. It can live in hot tubs, drinking fountains, you know, any place like that. And it will cause something called Legionnaire's disease, which is basically pneumonia. And what happens is that, you know, maybe it's in the water pipes and you're staying in a hotel, which is what happened, how it got its name. This was bacteria was first discovered in 1976. There was a convention happening in Philadelphia of this veterans group. They were called the Legionnaires. And they were staying in this hotel, and unfortunately the hotel had the Legionella bacteria living in its water pipes. And a lot of these veterans were elderly, which makes you more susceptible to these bacteria. And, you know, they go to take a shower, and when you turn the shower on, unfortunately, you know, you make a lot of steam, and so the bacteria would be in that steam and aerosolized, and then you could breathe in the bacteria. And so the Legionella bacteria get into the lungs, and then that can cause a pneumonia. So in people that are more elderly, or maybe, you know, your immune system is not that great, you can get this Legionnaire's disease, this pneumonia. So that can be an issue. Sometimes we'll see that like in apartment buildings, hotels, sometimes hospitals. Can have a problem. And this is a link to an article. This is a Legionnaire's disease outbreak that we had in an assisted living facility where they had 2 residents that got Legionnaire's disease. So I think that was in Taylorsville that happened. So that was a couple of years ago. So sometimes you'll see some outbreaks of this. So it's just something to be aware of. So now if you're healthy, you're probably not going to have to worry about this. Okay, so don't freak out about that one. Okay, but it's just unusual that it likes to live in these water tanks and pipes, and so yeah, very strange. Okay, our next one is Vibrio cholerae. And if you look at the name Vibrio, you can imagine the shape. So you've got that curved rod shape over here on the left. Looks like a comma. And looking at the name, it causes cholera. So this bacterium is going to be shed in the diarrhea of somebody that's infected, and it gets into the water supply or gets onto the food. And then the next person will ingest the contaminated food and water, and then that bacteria will get in the gut and then cause cholera in the next person. And what kills the person is dehydration, and it can kill the person within a couple hours because the diarrhea is so bad. You've got really watery diarrhea, so you can see on the bottom left, it's just this brown liquid watery stuff coming out, and you get these little flecks of mucus in there. It looks like little pieces of rice, so they call it rice water stool. And the diarrhea is so bad they call you faucet butt because it's just basically just liquid running out your rear end. And so you can see how it would be really easy not to be able to drink enough and keep up with all the water that you're losing and die of dehydration. So to treat people with this, you've got to either get to a healthcare facility where they put you on IV fluids to treat the dehydration, or if you're not near a healthcare facility, you can also take these oral rehydration salts. It's kind of like Gatorade that you mix up the powder with some water and you just keep drinking that, and that'll replace the water and electrolytes that you're losing, and that will save your life as well. And there's a link here to an article if you're interested in reading about this. This was one of the biggest cholera outbreaks that we've had, that we know about in history, and this was in Yemen. This was, I think, in 2016, and this, I think there was over 1 million cases, 1 million people that got infected with cholera, and what was happening is that there was a civil war, which is actually still going on in Yemen, and because the war, the water treatment plants and sewage and all of that had been destroyed, and so there wasn't clean drinking water, and so a lot of people got infected with that. And so you'll see cholera outbreaks, during war situations, refugee camps, just where there's not clean water, so we can see problems with that. All right, our next group, we've got these Enterobacterialis. So these are called enterics, and where do they live in the body? So remember we talked about entero, that's talking about the intestines. So they're going to be found normally living in the intestines or GI tract is where you would find these guys. Okay, and we're going to divide these enteric bacteria into two groups called coliforms and non-coliforms. And I just want you to have heard of these names. You don't have to memorize like which bacteria are coliform and which ones are not coliforms. I am not going to ask you that, okay? But the reason I want you to know these terms is that sometimes you'll hear on the news where they'll say, oh, there's a boil water advisory out because they've tested the drinking water after a storm or something, and they detected coliforms in the water. Well, what does that mean? It means that they found some of these species, like maybe E. coli or Klebsiella pneumoniae or Enterobacter. They detected those in the drinking water. And what that means is that there's been fecal contamination of the water. So you've got to boil the water to kill those bacteria before you drink it, because otherwise if you just drink it, you could ingest those and then maybe get some bad diarrhea from that. So that's what they're talking about. The non-coliforms are just saying that they're not as closely related to the E. coli. The coliforms, coli is referring to the E. coli, and these are just more closely related to E. coli, and the non-coliforms are not as closely related to E. coli, and they're grouped on whether they can ferment lactose or not. So that's how they classified them, and you don't have to know that, but I just want you you've heard the term coliform and non-coliform, and just if you hear on the news there's coliforms in the water, that means there's fecal material detected in the water, which is gross. So please boil your water. As we've talked about before, E. coli normally lives inside of our GI tract, and it normally doesn't cause disease, so it's not pathogenic. But it can cause disease if it gets in the wrong place. So for example, if it crawls up the urethra and gets into the bladder, it could cause a UTI. There are some strains of E. coli, though, that can cause disease, such as E. coli 0157H7, that normally lives in the intestines of cattle. So if that strain of E. coli contaminates beef and then you don't cook the meat well enough, or you don't wash your hands after handling the raw meat, then you could get infected with that strain of E. coli and it could make you sick. The other way that you could get the E. coli 0157H7 that sometimes you'll hear about with recalls is that if it gets into the water supply, like maybe irrigation water, and then that gets sprayed onto the fields of like lettuce or spinach or something, and then you eat that, then you could also get sick that way too. So the E. coli 0157H7 gives you some pretty bad diarrhea, stomach cramping, and in young kids, it can be pretty serious because it can actually cause kidney failure. So that's really scary. The other thing to remember about E. coli is that it's one of our CRE pathogens. So we talked about that in the discussion. So there are some strains of E. coli that have the ability to produce either those KPC or NDM enzymes and can chew up the carbapenem antibiotics, and that makes them resistant to those antibiotics, and then they can be very hard to treat. Okay, our next gram-negative bacteria is Salmonella enterica. There are over 2,400 different serovars, and a serovar is just another name for a strain. And almost all of the Salmonella serovars or strains are pathogenic, meaning they cause disease. So if you have Salmonella that gets inside your GI tract, it's probably going to make you sick. And where you get infected with Salmonella, most of the time it's going to be from food. So Salmonella is very commonly found in poultry and beef, so that meat. So if it's not cooked properly, or you didn't handle the raw meat correctly and you didn't wash your hands well or something, you can ingest this bacteria and can give you some bad diarrhea. The other way that you could also get this is also by raw milk, and then also handling like reptiles, amphibians, and even baby chicks. And then if you don't wash your hands, you could also get Salmonella from that. We also have eggs. They can have Salmonella. So, you know, probably not a good idea to be eating raw eggs either. Okay, and then we have one serovar of Salmonella, Salmonella enterica serovar typhi, that actually is only found in people. So you're only going to get this from another person. So this is not carried by animals. And this one causes typhoid fever. So I know that you've heard of typhoid fever before because if you're familiar with Typhoid Mary. So if you haven't heard that story, look her up, and we'll talk about Typhoid Mary later on as well. But this strain of salmonella is going to be shed on the stool of the infected person, contaminates the food or water, and then the next person will ingest it. And the reason it got its name, typhoid fever, it sounds very similar to typhus. And remember, typhus is caused by Rickettsia bacteria. And remember, Rickettsia bacteria causes a spotted fever. But Rickettsia bacteria and typhus, that's spread by lice. But here, you just have to ingest the salmonella bacteria to get typhoid fever. But they call it a typhoid fever because it does give you a rash and you get a pretty high fever, makes you kind of delirious for a few days. And they thought it looked similar to typhus, and that's how it got the name. It can kill people. So Typhoid Mary did end up spreading this bacteria, and she did end up causing the death of several people. Our next gram-negative bacteria is Klebsiella pneumoniae, and remember that bacterium is one of our CRE bacteria like the E. coli, and it's also one of our escape pathogens. So it's the K in the escape. So that means that it's going to be very resistant to a lot of our antibiotics, so it's going to be hard to treat. And it also causes a lot of nosocomial infections. So these are infections that are acquired when the patient is in the hospital. So they didn't come in with it, but they caught it while they were there. Some of the infections that Klebsiella pneumoniae can cause is it can cause pneumonia, which you can see as part of its name. It can get into wounds, causing wound infections, and then can also cause meningitis, which is pretty serious as well. All right, and then looking at the picture on the right, you can see that surrounding the bacterial cell, we've got this clear structure. And how we've done that with the stain to be able to see that clear structure is we've stained the background. And remember, that's called a negative stain when you stain the background. And that allows that clear structure, the capsule around the bacterial cell, to stand out. So you can see the bacterial capsule around the Klebsiella pneumoniae. Remember, the capsule is part of the glycocalyx. So it's made out of carbohydrates or sugars. And it's there to protect the bacteria, makes them slippery so our phagocytes can't grab onto them and eat them. And then also it helps them attach and stick to our body cells as well. Our next gram-negative bacteria is Proteus. If you look at a picture of Proteus down here on the bottom, the flagellar distribution pattern is peritrichous. So we've got flagella all the way around the cell. And this bacterium can cause urinary tract infections and also get into wounds, causing wound infections. And kind of the claim to fame with Proteus is if you're culturing this in the lab, growing it in a petri dish, it has what's called swarming motility. So if you put the Proteus bacteria in the center here, it will swim out to get more food, and then it will stop and lose its flagella, divide, produce the next generation, and then the next generation will swim out, get more food, stop, lose their flagella, divide, produce the next generation, which will then swim out and then stop and divide. And so you get these concentric rings. And so that's called swarming motility. So you get this really pretty ring pattern on the petri dish. So that's swarming motility with Proteus. Our next gram-negative bacterium is Yersinia pestis. It causes a very scary disease, the plague. The plague is also called the Black Death, and you can see a picture of why it's called the Black Death over here. This bacterium will trigger the clotting system in your blood, and these little blood clots will end up lodging in some of the smaller blood vessels in your extremity, like here in your hands, and that will block the blood flow to the tissue on the other side, and so they won't receive any blood, and the tissue dies and turns black. And then a lot of times you would die after that. So that's why they call it the Black Death. Another thing that this bacteria does is it also causes the lymph nodes to become very enlarged. So you can see this inguinal lymph node is huge. And those large lymph nodes are called buboes. And so one of the forms of the plague is called the bubonic plague. So it's referring to those enlarged lymph nodes. How the Yersinia pestis bacteria is transmitted to a person is most commonly through flea bites. So a flea will bite an infected rodent. So that usually will be something like a ground squirrel, maybe a prairie dog or a rat. And then the flea will pick up the Yersinia pestis bacteria, and then the flea will then go and bite you and give you the bacteria, and then now you've got the plague. So that's how it's spread. All right, and then our next gram-negative bacteria is Enterobacter, and remember that is one of our escape pathogens. So we're going to have some problems with antibiotic resistance. And it's also an infection that we can see in our hospitalized patients that they can pick up while they're there. And this is also one that can cause UTIs. All right, now we have Haemophilus influenzae. This one has an interesting name. It does not cause influenza or the flu, but they used to think it did, because when they would have people die of the flu, they would do autopsies and look at the lungs under the microscope, and they would sometimes see Haemophilus influenzae under the microscope. Well, sometimes what happens when you get the flu, which is caused by the influenza virus, people would sometimes, after getting the flu, would get a bacterial infection caused by Haemophilus influenzae afterwards, and they get this bacterial pneumonia, and then that would kill them. So they thought that this bacterium was causing the flu, but it wasn't. But they didn't have electron microscopes yet, and so they couldn't actually see the influenza virus. So that's how it got the name, even though it doesn't cause the flu. So obviously Haemophilus influenzae can cause pneumonia. And it used to be a big cause of meningitis in kids under 5 years of age, but we do have a vaccine against Haemophilus influenzae, so we don't see it causing meningitis in young kids very much anymore because of the vaccine. And it can also cause earaches too. All right, and then our last two gram-negative bacteria in the proteobacteria to talk about, we've got Campylobacter and Helicobacter, and both of these bacteria are spirilla. So they're kind of that spiral or corkscrew shape. They're thicker and rigid compared to the spirochetes. So they're not going to be flexible, they don't bend. So these guys are spirilla. Right, Campylobacter jejuni. This one is found in the intestines of cattle and also poultry. So it can contaminate the meat, and it can also be found in raw milk. And if you ingest undercooked meat, or don't handle the meat correctly, don't wash your hands, or if you drink raw milk, you could get infected with Campylobacter jejuni. And it will give you some pretty bad diarrhea, stomach cramping, and you will not feel very good. And then we talked about Helicobacter pylori before. It can cause peptic ulcers. Peptic ulcer just is referring to the fact that this bacteria can cause ulcers from the lower esophagus to the stomach to the first part of the intestine. So just kind of referring to that area. That's what peptic is referring to. And then interestingly, it's also been associated with causing stomach cancer. So that's really interesting that a bacteria could cause stomach cancer.